it's
Yeah.
about whose brain is working.
With half of it, half
a brain each.
Yeah.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Keith May, who is, if I get this right, he recently appointed visiting professor at the University of South Wales.
That is right. Yes, thank you for reminding me of that.
And we've got someone waiting to come in, so I'll just do that. So Keith, when he's not a visiting professor at the University of South Wales, works in Historic England, and we've been working together for, well, off and on for some years now, really, and most recently on this project, the Matrix project, which is looking at the sort of, well, colloquially, where matrices go to die, essentially, but it's about the life and reuse potential of matrices and digital tools for matrices. And I think I'm just going to hand it over to Keith, really, and let him talk about this. So over to you. Let's go.
Okay, thank you, James. And yeah, I'll introduce the full title of what I'm presenting: The Matrix: Connecting and Reusing Digital Records and Archives of Archaeological Investigations. That's actually the title of a project which I have AHRC funding for, and that is actually a leadership fellowship as it happens, which has been running for a couple of years. I've got James's name. I should reciprocate that James is also part of that project team on that project. Thank you for inviting me here today, and also I must credit the name in the middle there is Kerry Binding, who is researcher at the University of South Wales, as James mentioned, where I have the professorship now. And Kerry really is, I would say, the wizard in Wales, who has done a lot of the software work, does the programming that you'll see later on when I get further into the presentation. I think that's credited everyone that is in need of crediting here, but there are some more credits at the end, and you'll recognize the slide which I have credited to Warner Brothers just in case. And I need to advance the screen. There we go. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about, I think we've got about half an hour to 40 minutes here and some time for questions at the end. But I'm going to sort of obviously introducing the project and then cover these sort of areas around data quality and stratigraphic principles and kind of needs that arise in for sort of interchange of data coming out of using archive records, particularly as it's sort of says here, focusing in on analysis and phasing processes as we go through. You'll see some sort of things to do with process modeling that we've done work on. I will present this software prototype tool towards the end more. We're going to talk a little about introduce some stuff around linked open data vocabularies, which may be of interest, hopefully, and then questions around sort of methodologies for phasing from the archaeological point of view. So we're probably going to be switching backwards and forwards between some of the technical software and online data archiving issues, and also some of the archaeological process issues and methodologies that lie behind this, including the value of some of this work in relation to sort of scientific dating, Bayesian, particularly Bayesian chronological modeling, and then sort of look to where things may be going forward further on the back of the project, really, and project outcomes. So as a starting point, I'm not sure the audience here, I suspect everyone is an archaeologist and is fully, or at least well aware of stratigraphy principles, but this is the starting point. Clearly, these principles have been in place, as we see, sort of, well, geological principles, but certainly I think that a key part of where these stratigraphic principles came into more recent use, or relatively recent use, was the work of Harris in the 70s and 80s, coming from Winchester, and then developing this with archaeologists in London, and how these principles could be implemented. For those that are less familiar, there is a link. I would thorough credit actually Ed Harris, who I have spoken to in the course of this project, and a lot of the materials now are up online through his harrismatrix.com. So people that want to to pick up on some of those works can go there. And I will say it's been very useful being able to even just reuse some of the materials that are in there from those works, like some of the diagrams and things you'll see. But clearly that is now sort of what with 40 years on, and what we're exploring in the project is how perhaps some of these laws and principles have been used and implemented. And as we know, the principles are good, but that was one of the things we were discussing with people during the project. But it's also much more about the practice of how these have been put into practice, and that's where perhaps, you know, we're coming at this, certainly I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone going into archives and trying to reuse data. And I've done a range of projects, as I'll mention as I go through, over the last 10 to 15 years, trying to work with data. And there have been some underlying issues around the consistency, or what I say particularly in what we colloquially call post-excavation. I'm always nervous I call it post-excavation, because I always have this belief that ideally we're trying to do analysis. The more analysis we can do on site, the better. And I think that's one of the things that the digital tools, as more and more of our work has become digital in the field, we are actually able to do some of the tasks and things that were known as post-ex, perhaps in the field more. And I think that is a trend that will continue as more and more of our data becomes more live during the excavation process. Nevertheless, we are still faced with the question of some of it gets done by experts and other scientific processes that happen later, and particularly dating and analysis are all a kind of process that comes later on, and therefore you're left to some extent with a different set of data through that analytical process. Things like phasing and grouping and features come in at a later stage. And one of the kind of questions that has arisen through our research is, how does that data get stored in archives, and particularly for reuse purposes? Because if you only take the data that comes straight off the site, you don't end up with a lot of the interpretive phasing and dating information that actually leads to the conclusions of what is published. And there's this sort of hiatus, as I see it, that can't ends up, particularly depending on kind of digital methods that are used in analysis. So one of the things we focused in on, obviously I have been using the digital archive records at ADS, and I put up this question there: is there a common use of something called a phasing index? This is something that has come through from looking at the archives online that there are, and in particular something that MOLA, the Museum of London Archaeologists, have developed, something called the Index of Archaeological Association. But I think there are various versions of this, but I've just put this up as a sort of example of what I'm talking about in terms of the kind of data that comes through from analysis, where you have, you know, groups, subgroups, all in. I don't know how much you can see where I'm pointing, but those orange headers, you don't have to read the details of this, but the point being that there are a number of fields that people use, and generally there's sort of a level of grouping, phasing, periodization, which we'll come back to as a terminology. But what we were interested in the matrix in particular was whether we found other examples of people depositing indices of this type, and how consistent those data were, so that we could reuse them. And a key point says on the side there, still bearing in mind that there's no primary stratigraphic relationships in this index. So we end up having the sort of what we call when I call the primary stratigraphic relationships, I'm talking about the key above, below, equals, if you like, relationships that you get purely represented in the stratigraphic matrix. In that process that you use to take those data through to produce further information, such as shown in this sheet. That's just a CSV which came straight off ADS. So So what is the background to some of this, or why we're doing this, is again sort of work I've been doing with others in terms of trying to look into commonalities in systems. And I will make a broad generalization here, is that we've looked across Europe and different recording systems, and there is, as everyone knows who goes out in the field, you can almost find one recording sheet for every organization you go to in the field. Nevertheless, the actual things they record are often very, very, quite similar in the field work, in the sense that everybody has to be out there and using the same system, and that's crucial in terms of actually getting the data off the site. And most people have some sort of manual. I always refer to something like this that people use in field work, but it's noticeable that there isn't anything quite like that when it comes to post-excavation work. And that was the thing which, when we first sort of went out of the matrix, the project was initiated, I had this idea that I would approach units to ask about the post-excavation procedures, and that I would pick up some form of manual from them that we could put together and understand how their post-ex processes were undertaken. But that, as it turned out, wasn't really what happened, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Now, I always point out at this point that I am not trying to reinvent wheels. We know that there are digital tools out there, and therefore quite a lot of, but there are issues around those. So some of the older ones are now, to be honest, reaching the point where they no longer function. They're based on Windows, versions of Windows software that have become redundant or out of date, and I had the early stage of the project, I had to actually reboot a laptop with Windows 7 on just to get some of the data out of Stratify. Harris Matrix Composer is good, but you have to pay for it, and that was some of the feedback we got from quite a lot of people around whether they were using tools at all. And this is where it feeds into practice in terms of what the outputs are that you get in the archive. And the practice, to be frank, it is variable. The feedback we got was that people would not generally be paying for software because their use of using the matrices was intermittent. And I think this is another issue, is how often people actually use the software in order to write up a site. And if you're not doing that on a fairly regular basis, then often those, not only the tools aren't used, but those skills aren't necessarily there. Some people who feel comfortable with doing software, we're working with tools, we'll work with them, but often that's not the case. And a simple solution often taken forward is to use Excel, and that seemed to be the most commonly used method, was to put something into an Excel spreadsheet. But the problem with the Excel spreadsheet was that they were always as diagrams and boxes and lines, but they are not programmatically reusable, and that was something we really wanted to follow up with people. I asked people in the course of the project how they shared data, what experiences were of sharing data across different organizations. And again, there was a lot of sort of personal communication around that people were happy to kind of share on an individual basis, but there was no sort of formal way in which this information would get shared. If you went out and was digging a site next door and you wanted to know where the Stratigraphic archive was for the site that had been recently dug nearby, that was very hard to come across. Particularly if the chances that you would find that in an online archive were limited. Partly because of the timescales it takes to get stuff through that process. We know how it takes a lot longer to get stuff through to the point where you can deposit stuff from the analysis phase. So the crucial point there is there's multiple forms of mixed explicit data. Right, I'm going to go now into a little bit around process model. One of the things we did, as I say, was to try and ask people if they had existing manuals that we could put together and see whether or not that there was a common process. And in the end, this was done more from the point of view of what feedback we got from people. I had interviews with people during, obviously a lot of this happened during COVID, so I had to talk to people online. as opposed to visiting, although I did visit some of the units in the early part of the project before COVID. I went and interviewed basically for what I would say 10 of the main archaeological organisations like Oxford, Wessex, Molar, obviously Headland, Cotswold, people from those different organisations involved in stratigraphic work, and we had some workshops doing that. And the aim was, as I say, to try and build up a sense of what the common steps in the process were, so that we could kind of map data across if there was data available. And I would say this diagram, again, bear with me, you don't have to zoom in and read the details of the diagram, but the idea is that there is a kind of commonality in what people think goes on in the process. So that middle lane, to an extent, represents the idea that there's an excavation, you assess the stuff in the excavation, you go through analysis, you produce a publication, and you produce an archive. But a lot of the feedback we got from the sector was that there were sort of two sides to this mainstream of archaeology, and it won't surprise you to hear one stream, and the bottom stream was perhaps followed that process more conventionally or more typically, partly due to funding. If they were funded, say, by a research institution, a university, or a state-funded project that had research funding, then they kind of had the funding that would take that project right through those various stages, and you could follow that through fairly systematically. But for those working in the commercial development sector, or CRM as it's known in the States, where I presented some of this, you find particularly that they're around that point where there's this triangle, that there's a bit of a hiatus in the process, that people produce data from the excavation. They might produce a report on what they found, but the actual data is not necessarily then, partly due to funding, there may not be funding on to follow the project through, or the scale of the sites, often small sites, they have to put a number of sites together to make a sensible sort of synthetic report to get it through to publication. So that's the idea here, really, that there are key stages that projects go through, and therefore the data that travels, and the data, some of the data isn't there until at least the analysis process, and other data can be appended or updated accordingly at those different stages. For those that may or may not know, I've put updated DMP there. Data management plans are things which are now becoming more widely thought about, shall we say, in the sector, and there are to some extent a requirement for research funding, but they're something that we're trying to embed more in the commercial sector side to again just try and reflect where data changes throughout this process. And a key point here why I've put that reuse pink box again is that the data from the archive at the end of a site is likely to become the data that is needed at the start of a new site. So referencing and keeping your information updated in the data management, it is really useful in terms of reuse for the next person coming along trying to work out what data there is that they might be able to reuse. But key point again, just to say, it's more of a research cycle process than just a linear idea. That idea that the data, we want this research to be reused and the data to be reused. A further detailed diagram, again, I don't expect you to read all the details here, but just to show that we went into some more depth in how we modeled the information in order to inform the building of the prototype software and feedback from people on what the key stages were that they would want to undertake in looking at analysis of work. As I say, identifying the common steps in the analysis process through interviewing these archaeologists in the different organizations, and in the long run, we're trying to identify semantic mappings as well between some of the key concepts in this as well, so that data can be made more interoperable if in the longer run. So to simplify that, we sort of have a 5-step process where we're sort of saying data comes off the excavation. We talk about subgrouping and grouping as 2 steps, and that again draws out certainly the degree of the level of complexity in sites is important here, that not everybody needs to subgroup and not everybody needs to go into the same levels of detail depending on the nature of the archaeology on the site. And that is a really crucial thing we'll come back to. Actually, sorry, I should finish that. The fourth one in the middle is about the dated finds. We have a process which you'll see around how we introduce dating into the matrix, and then phasing and getting data. Key point about exporting data out as well at the end, so that it's again for reuse and making it fair. So I'm going to say a little bit about sort of stratigraphic standards and the need for these. As I say, we have principles, but where it comes to actually how the data is archived, it's less clear. And I think one of the key points in this slide is that what we tend to find more often than if we find any stratigraphic data in terms of matrices, it's at best a PDF image in the back of a report at the moment, in terms of certainly commercial projects. And of course, that just really doesn't enable reuse of data at all. And there's a question around how useful a PDF image is at all, and unless you can work with the data. I mean, it's important to have a version of a matrix that's been produced, but that you need to reference it against data that underlies it in terms of the basic stratigraphic relationships. And the argument here really is that I see the stratigraphy in terms of the above, below, and correlation of data. It's like a skeleton of a site. To some extent, it represents. You can get a real sense of the scale of the site and the nature of the archaeology from the stratigraphy. Now, that is not to say that every site will have complex stratigraphy, and hence the jellyfish in the picture. That I fully appreciate that some sites, you've got a lot of isolated cemeteries without stratigraphy between, then you may not have an argument for producing a complex matrix, and certainly that's a point I'll come back to further again. But the key one here is about trying to at least have consistent standards and consistent formats for preservation, interchange, sharing, and reuse of the relationships. Things like CSVs, which can be converted to RDS, XML, JSON formats, and then you have the opportunity also to introduce things like linked open data for some of the terminologies, and that. At this point, I'll start talking about more of how we use those formats. Key point in some of the work that we've done in the past that led to the matrix was the fact that the matrices, as well as having the before and after relationships and the correlates and the equals, have these other temporal operator relationships sort of implicitly buried in the diagrams. A lot of the work that people do when they phase things, are they're saying that, okay, I've got a particular phase with date range, and I'm going to say, you know, these contexts occurred during that phase. Or when they're correlating things like groups, they're trying to say, oh yes, you know, that open area surface outside was in use at the same time of that building there on that other strand, and I need to say they were actually in use at the same time and overlapped in time. And the other point about the phasing is that usually we have multiple phases and we run them concurrently, and we say we are basically those dotted lines represent where the matrix, different phases in the matrix meet in time, and those key and operators are something that we'll come back to and see how we've tried to implement that. We have implemented them and tried to make them more explicit in how the tools work, so that we have ways in which people can make better use of those within the software. This came out of some of the semantic technologies for archaeological resources project work that we did back STAR project 2011, where we were looking at how to search across different data from a multiple range of different organizations across England, including things like data for natural language processing in OASIS reports, and in the end, the project to some extent proved the technologies, and some of that work has gone on in further projects where it's been used in things like Ariadne and Ariadne Plus and these projects for proving interoperability, but what we found was that there was issues around connecting the data. And again, this question that you couldn't necessarily interrogate at a sort of data, at a site level data. If you wanted to go deeper into the data sets once you'd found them, say on some kind of interoperable search engine, you want to put a bunch of sites together, it was much harder to then do that if you didn't have all the phasing information to actually ask, you know, what are all the finds from phase X, Y, or Z. Final thing I was going to say at this point was just that as I did get round to visit some of the people before the COVID lockdown, we went back. I mentioned earlier that a lot of people are using Excel spreadsheets, and I just will share one of these examples, not naming names, and the work here was by an absolutely exemplar archaeological stratigraphic analyst who was working on sites, you know, with something like several thousand contacts, possibly up to like 20,000 contacts in London, and trying to stick them together. And when I asked them why they had put yellow lines on their matrix on the connectors between the stratigraphic relationships lines between the context boxes there, he told me that he had to do that because when there was a limit on the amount that Excel could take, and there was sort of like whether it was 11,000 content, whatever, however many columns, and the system, then the Excel sheet had crashed, and he had to go back in and literally color in all the lines again, because when they re-imported it, it had duplicated all the lines, and he needed to color in the ones that were real and not the ones that were duplicates. And I just dare say at that point I felt I was going to cry because the amount of work involved in that. So challenges and interim conclusions of reuse of data. And I'm going to look a little more about how we've been using this stuff. One of the things we're looking into is the fact that the stratigraphy varies between different types of site. And we were kind of alluded to the difference that you can get between urban and rural sites. And particularly, we're sort of saying there's a big difference between perhaps deep urban stratigraphy, the use of matrices in deep urban stratigraphic areas, and things where you're just doing perhaps an infrastructure site, digging a road corridor, and you're out in the middle of nowhere, and all you've got is sort of top, middle, bottom, and you don't need a complex matrix. So I think we need some signposting around sort of conventions for when it's necessary to do some of this, when we'd expect to find this work, and therefore when we would expect to have some of this data available for reuse. So I put there the big question marks around consistency and reusability of these byproducts, because the nature of the projects and the sites to some extent is dictating what ends up in the archive at the moment. I just emphasize that some of the process is also changing and maturing as we go through. In the past, this is Harris's view of how we went through the process of going from stratigraphic sequence, did the phasing, you basically write up the report, publish the report, and that data would end up in some form in an archive. Now we have all the introduction of GIS and structure of motion, other technologies coming through, which to some extent supersede some of that work. And I certainly had a lot of feedback from people working on people like Alex Smith at Headland saying that they're using a GIS, they can just group straight off the GIS and not necessarily through a matrix software tool. Again, Bayesian chronological modeling has affected how we implement dating as well in our records. I think I will speed through because I know time is passing through, but this is really just to reiterate that point about the funding sources and the recording methods having some influence on what is ending up in our archives. And I think this is important in terms of how we signpost better to people what data they would expect to find if they want to reuse it. So I'm not picking on those particular organizations in the sense that the point here is really that things kind of move forward since the days when the first sort of stratigraphic principles were put into place. And in particular, I mean, Ed Harris actually said to me that the matrix was adopted in London, particularly in the 80s, because it allowed people to dig the sites effectively. And I think that is a fundamental point in all this, that often it's not about standards saying you must do it this way. Often the things almost become a de facto standard because they become the most useful tool in the way that people want to work, like GIS. So again, I think I mentioned earlier this idea, the question of sort of like, do we group, phase, periodize systematically? And again, obviously, we all know it will depend on the nature of the archaeology you're dealing with. At the same time, in terms of sort of trying to look at the semantics of trying to make data interoperable, a useful point I always mention here, Tom Dye, who's worked with Caitlin Buck on some of the Bayesian modeling, and they, of course, in chronological modeling, they have their own terminology for phase, but he points out that the terms period and phase are defined variously and sometimes interchangeably by archaeologists, and that is demonstrated as I went and looked through what is the Harris's matrix composer, and even in the help file, whereas Tom on the left is talking about phases and talks phase groups contexts of a similar age and periods group phases of a similar age, and there's a kind of higher nested series of time intervals. Interestingly, in the composer, he slightly defines phases and periods differently, and they're not contradictory. The important point is that they are doing slightly different things with the data, and we need to actually understand where they're talking about differences between periods and phases. I won't dwell on that, but you get the point. On a plus, though, that this is an example of one of the excavations that we did find data in the ADS was from the XSM10 Crossrail site, which is the one of the there was a series of Crossrail sites, about 30 dug across, as it suggests, across London. For those that remember, know it's now been called, I think, Elizabeth Line. But even though there were 30 Crossrail sites, it was noted that actually only 2 of them actually deposited matrix versions of matrices and data that we and in fact only one of them had what I would call a number of phases that we've focused on, where we had phases from pre-Roman up to through Roman medieval to post-medieval, and so in the end, I mean, the key point is there was literally one site that we first came across when we really searched across this, and that was with ADS's help. And I'm not in any way, there's no critique of ADS at all. That this was what was in the archive. The point here is there is a lot of data in the archives, but they're not necessarily all comprehensive. And the fact that the 30 different sites didn't all archive with the same level of consistency, I think is the key point here. Even though individually the sites are quite coherent, I'm not knocking why this happens. People are going to focus their time primarily on getting a site finished, and their individual sites, they get their archives nailed down. But not everyone is then thinking, how is that my site going to work alongside everybody else's site? So I think I've made the point about the software being used infrequently, what fits on the scene, and we talked to, as I say, post-ex veterans about this, and that was a lot of the feedback we got were from people that were doing this. So as a sort of picking up some experiences and conclusions before I move on to looking at the prototype. I'm going to really argue in here we need more consistency in these digital records and archives of the stratigraphic data and the temporal relationships. If we're going to reuse them, we have a lot of proliferation of data in other areas, like lots of the sites send in photographs and things, but they don't necessarily put all the data in. Data that, if we want to reuse data, we need the data that's fit for purpose. So the matrix data really needs to be at least in a minimum of CSV files that can be reused, rather than just as images of matrix diagrams in PDFs. I'm not saying you can't have both, but certainly PDF is not adequate, and it needs to be based on the processes that are used using the Harris matrix as well. So talking with Ed Harris, one of the things that came out of conversation, he was a keynote speaker at a symposium I gave at the Society of American Archaeologists last year. And he's still advocating for some sort of international convention on stratigraphic recording, analysis and documentation, despite the fact that he's written the books and the principles are there, and there's still scope for those principles to be sort of more better, shall we say, consistency and more and understanding of when and how they're used and what data results. And I've put in there quickly a sort of better understanding communication and more interoperable records. Gingy boundary is to do with where the underlying archaeology, where the archaeology is recorded at the base level, and I might mention that later on. Come back to it later on. A key point again, in order to make stratigraphic data fair, is that we need to have more use of these data management plans that make it clear how that data is going to appear in the archives to make it more findable and reusable across present-day geopolitical, as I say, and spatial temporal boundaries. So my next point is to show you some of the software. Software is available, it's up online. So I want to show you, give you a flavor. I'm not going to try and do a demo, but I am going to show you some video shots taken from the software. Key message here is I am not trying to sell software. This is not intended to be a fully functional software system that you could just go and buy or take off the shelf. However, it was a tool there that was designed to help demonstration and elicit the feedback from people during the project. It is functional and it can be used, and people are using it. Jay Carwell has actually emailed me last week and said he wants to use it for a small project that he's working on, but there are caveats, and I will say a bit more about that. What it is also used for is that I'm taking this forward, the ideas that are coming out of the project with FAME, the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers, around what more we might do to develop tools, potentially what tools are needed online, and crucially about the sustainability of some of this sort of software and in the information from the archaeological, particularly the commercial archaeological sector. So what do you have to do? Well, links to the app are up there. Obviously, you take a CSV, you pull in people that must know what CSV, I think, in this community, but we're just taking the 4 fields that you need just to show you that. There is online handbook and help. Kerry Bynum has done a great job of creating help files. So if you go and look at the tool, you can dig in and look. And making you aware that if you look for the help file, it'll explain a lot of the things that I won't be able to cover here. And the prototype really is a browser-based client-side software. So the point being that you load data up, you work online, and then you can download the data back. And therefore, the overall sort of strategy of that is that people might, if they're using the same tool, the data could end up broadly in the same kind of format and the same structures across different organizations. It doesn't mean they won't be using their own internal software as well, but they can use a tool and bring data up and back as they need it. And perhaps the question I've got at the bottom there is about the scale. One of the issues around, I will say at this level around online tools, that it makes for issues around scaling and speed. So we're currently working around the idea that you've got about 500 to 3,000 contexts and average sort of site size. A huge site, this may not be the tool to use, but that may well be the case where people, from the feedback we got, they may well have standalone software because they would have an adequate case of doing it. But it is a question, like, how often do people have sites bigger than 5,000? Even the XSN type site that we used had to split their matrix in 2, because they said that they only managed about 3,000 contexts at a time. And here's the tool. I will show you some of this work in using. We've implemented the linked open data for periods. So, for instance, you can import this linked open data if you want to put your period terminology in. You'll see that it's currently got about 151 different periods, because these periods are across international boundaries. So there's different languages. You'll see in there Spanish, French, there's even Japanese at the end. The point being, not that we've made this a completely sort of multilingual tool, but the idea is just again to demonstrate that you pick your periods according to the spatio-temporal position of your site. So if you're working in Greece, you can pick Greek terminology rather than trying to shoehorn everything into periods. But of course, in this context, we're working within England, and we've picked the periods that are standard within the UK, and just demonstrating really that, not surprising, you can, if you want to call a cremation burial a Roman cremation burial, there you have a link to the actual linked over data period term, and you're not typing it in and having problems with spelling errors and things like that. Similar sort of approach to, we're very important that we would allow people to introduce dating into their tool that they could use and load dates up. You see here, we also came up with the idea of making the context visible when dating evidence have been added. So you're basically just loading data, dating evidence for each context. It's crucial as you'll see later, in terms of how we've used dating to do temporal reasoning on the matrix, that you're able to load data.
Lost you, Keith. Can you hear us?
Dates and yes.
Oh, you're back. It's okay.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, I've just got a message saying internet. I've got my internet plugged in. Can you still hear me? Yeah. I will skip through this one then. Another key thing is that we just put some basic validation in. The feedback we got was that, you know, people want to check data as part of the tool, is part of the process of matrix, is to check that they've got all the groups in the right place. They've got context, they haven't got groups without context. And this brought out again this question around sort of conventions, and where some of these rules, they're not hard and fast. We're not saying you must have this or the thing won't work. We're flagging these as sort of where the traffic light system to say there may be an issue in some of your data. You know, if you've got a phase that hasn't got any context in it, a subgroup needs to go into a phase. But clearly there are sort of like conventional things where, particularly this one, where we've got no further excavation, and plus the tops and bottoms, how people record the top and bottom, which may sound, you know, it's not a huge issue, but we need to be clear how people are doing it, because it becomes important for things like taking forward things like the scale of the Anthropocene. You need to know where the bottom of the archaeology, whether people stopped because there was no more archaeology, or whether they stopped simply because they stopped because that's where the developers said they needed to finish, and the site, there was still archaeology left underneath. This again really just, I'm getting towards the end of just showing that we made decisions around checking temporality within phases. So using those Allen operators, we started to be able to bring in relationships that were temporal between different strands of the matrix. So not just above, below, and contemporary or equals, but actually whether the different groups were finishing at the same time, whether they overlapped, what phases, what groups were contained within which phases temporally. And that was key in terms of this process. Then we started to actually check in that bottom table where you can see the sort of red and orange. Again, the traffic light system was enable us to flag where we had inconsistencies between the stratigraphic records and the temporal data in the dating records. So that, you know, if you had a stratigraphic relation that said something was above, but your dating evidence was actually saying it was that the things were before, you would flag that up to the archaeologist concerned. And that is a new step, which was part of the point of actually showing that the tool was able to do this. And there are other, you know, elements in that which allows to feed things through for the Bayesian chronological modeling. It allows you to start searching across different strands of the matrix, relationships between different strands of the matrix. I'll move on quickly. One of the things I will say, if anyone does want to use this, you must be aware it is a client-side online browser tool, and therefore you need to save regularly in JSON format. You can basically load in anything, your files you have in JSON format, but the first time you put data in, you need to save in the JSON format, and then you can basically reuse that file each time you want to add more data in. We've included the import and export options in CSV for the different areas of data, so that people can get it out in different chunks according to how they want it, or we can stitch it together a bit like the phasing index that I showed earlier on, the index of archaeological association. We could build that together with this. We put some search mechanisms in based on the sort of semantic side of things, but we didn't go very far down that because, you know, within the scale of the project that we had, that was demonstrated, but that's an experimental thing. But we could do more for enhancing searching and use of linked open data. We talked to people about group matrices, and there seemed to be ambiguities around how much people use group matrices. Again, I think it was down to scale of site, but that functionality is again just as an overview, but we haven't gone into great depth on that. But we have, as I say, included this ability to do the stratigraphic and temporal comparison. And there is a link up to the Matrix website and the software that's available on the site. I think we've recorded, the slides will be shared, or the recording will be shared. So I put that in so people who want to go and find this and can link through themselves. As I say, I would not recommend loading in huge data sets, but start small and see if it's useful. And with that, references to all these fine people that have helped along the way, and some of the online resources that are useful as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. So, any questions?
I've just thrown lots of you. Have I stopped sharing? Okay.
You have stopped sharing, yeah.
Good. You can't see me though, can you? So I should have put my, sorry, did I not put my picture on at all? Hello.
Well, welcome to the room, Keith. Hi. I've opened the chat, so if anyone online has questions, feel free just to type them in, or just put your hand up and I'll do my best to note that you're there. But in the room is going to kick things off with, there are no... You
might have to speak up. I can hear some of you better than others, but just about, to be honest.
I'm close.
Oh, I think I know you, don't I? It's a bit fuzzy as well, so forgive my eyesight.
No, I guess my question is just because I'm just a little bit unclear into how you envisage this stuff being reused, actually.
That was one of my backup questions.
Because obviously, are you seeing this as a kind of more transparency for how you're deciding stuff on site? Or are you just thinking about when new dating things come in, you might want to reassess a whole site? I'm just a little bit unclear on how you're envisaging the reuse of this data. Sorry, do you want to elaborate?
It's fair because there's two reasons behind the tool. So one reason is reuse, but the tool is obviously there for people to put data in from scratch. So what we're trying to do is find a way in which we can encourage the data to be produced going forward in a way that is more consistent, and and we can build the sort of conventions and guide it alongside it to say this is actually what people are doing broadly across the sector, and therefore data is more comparable from different projects. But yeah, in terms of reuse, I would say it is likely to be more used in situations in urban centres where somebody's going out and digging a site and they want to actually open up the matrix for a site that was dug next door nearby, and actually understand if their phasing fits with, for instance, the phasing of an adjacent site. And that certainly is one example I would see of reuse. But I would agree there are questions around how else other people want to use it. I think reusing data, again, I say from the Bayesian chronological modeling, there is this point about trying to extract clear, what Caitlin Buckers calls sort of tight dating evidence. So they do, for instance, go and reuse data from different sites and try and look for how the phasing has been done and where where the dating evidence is viable. And I didn't put the slide in, did I, James, from Chapel Hill, of Alex Bayliss lying on the floor with a huge bit of paper trying to correlate sites. But that element is another reuse case. But I think, you know, does that help answer? I have further answers, but I'll try and stop.
Yeah, and yeah, I think the Bayesian chronology is an important one, actually. But Julian, I noticed that you put a question, or you have a question. Go.
Yeah, thanks. Hi,
Oh,
Keith.
Julian, hello. I didn't know.
Hello there. Again.
See the third day running.
Indeed, stop. I should probably know the answer to this, but I honestly don't. But I wondered if the increase in tablet-based and other handheld born digital recording systems on site was leading to an increase in born digital stratigraphic data that might then form part of an archive. I'm thinking, for example, of Mola for the Channel Tunnel Euston station excavations. And so, do you happen to know? Did you cover that in your survey?
I would say personally, yes. I mean, clearly it is, but the speed with which it's feeding through. I mean, I think it's interesting that we picked out infrastructure projects. I would say infrastructure projects seem to be coming through the process quicker than others, which, and you're kind of aware of some of the politics, you know, there's some politics in that as well. And resourcing, the money is there, and the project management systems are put in place on those larger projects, and to get those kind of deliverables perhaps again more consistent. And I think, you know, on a plus note, that is helping. And I think, yes, certainly there is more. The trend, I think, is positive towards that digital recording of primary data, but that doesn't necessarily solve my point around the hiatus in the analysis processes. And I think, I mean, perhaps I don't want to like make it sound like overly critical of what people are doing. I'm just really trying to highlight it's almost a hidden issue that we're all kind of doing what we're doing, but not necessarily trying to understand in the analysis stage that perhaps there needs to be a little bit more consensus. And I think that the people at FAME, certainly when I spoke to FAME, I raised this question of whether there could be a handbook for post-excavation, which highlighted if you're doing grouping, these are the kind of data, you know, what are the main kind of data fields you would expect in that grouping phase, and just being able to say, yes, we output ours in this format, or our database outputs it as this kind of file, and here it is. I think it would help, to be honest, I hope it would help AVS in signposting. I know, you know, we've talked about this a lot in my role with talking to you and Katie and Holly, that it's often, you know, hard to know how people are looking for things, unless and you need to be able to sort of signpost people. If you are going to reuse stratigraphic data, here's where these projects would actually have it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, but by the way, I can't resist letting people know that while you were talking, the Prime Minister resigned.
Oh, you're kidding? No
connection, I'm sure.
Sorry, are we still recording? You really shouldn't record me laughing like that, should you? But you heard it here first. I think I might have been gazumped somewhere.
How do you follow that? I mean, another thing that's to note is that everybody, you know, in relation to what you say, all those digital methods that you're seeing on site, I mean, nobody does it the same way, right? So I mean, everybody's got their own slightly different approach to this, I think, and that's part of the problem we're finding too. But yeah. Anyway, any other questions?
I mean, my time is nearly up. It was Hen was asking, is that right? Yeah. And the reuse, and with Julian here, I mean, I'm glad you're here, Julian, because the last thing I want to do is make people think, oh yes, I'm not finding stuff in the ADS. ADS is a wonderful resource, and all this is about trying to make it as useful and usable as possible. And I think that's there are still these questions that we're working on what is the sensible reuse of data, and perhaps which data is most important to us.
Yeah.
And I think that is still it's still an open question. I think Julian is nodding, and I think it's important to us that we don't just, there's this danger of that people just archive everything because they think that's the safe way to do it. And it's not that, it's not always that helpful. If you archive everything, you know, you're almost back to square one. We need to be a little bit better, I think, at signposting what data is useful in what circumstances, and that's kind of our challenge, I think, digitally, talking to the digital lab going forward. So thank you. If there's no further questions, I think we may all now need to go and look at the news from what Julian said.
Thank you very much, Keith. I will speak to you tomorrow anyway, about all
Oh,
of it in more-
brilliant, James. Thanks for that.
And yeah, it's been great to have you, and it's really nice to sort of see some of this work being presented. We've been working on it for a while now. haven't we?
Yes. I will say, of course, we're going to our plan. James is talking to me tomorrow. We're planning to publish, hopefully, Internet Archaeology. That's not breaking any rules, and possibly a couple of articles anyway, possibly antiquity. So, but that'll take a little while. Project's still running until December. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Keith. And hopefully see you when you're up and around again, moving around. We'll see you in York soon, hopefully.
Yeah, you have switched the recording off.
Yeah. Yes, I can work out how. Is it just that one?